My mom might be
Who's
watching.
going? That would be fun.
Hi, Mom.
If your mom does watch, I hope she asks me book questions.
Ooh. I'll text her right now. Mom.
And there we are.
Dun, da, da, da. I was about to go on, and then I went to look at my face in the bathroom, and I had pizza sauce on my face.
Nice.
So I should have just left it.
Cool. I have shared us to Facebook as well.
Oh, snap.
We are there. I am now going to be monitoring our
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. So, although it is doing something a little bit funny right now. Monitoring. What has happened there? Oh. Okay. Looks like we're good. YouTube has caught back up. For anybody who is watching, if you end up having any lag or anything going on with your viewing, let me know and I'll see if there's anything weird going on my end. In the meantime, hi, Kate Woodman.
Hi.
Long time no see. I'm excited. I know. Long time no see. Since like yesterday. It's been so long.
It's been like 12 hours.
Oh, 12 hours. I don't know. I could live without you for that long.
I know. It's been hard.
But you endured. You made it.
I did, yeah.
And we're here now. So welcome to the Social Hour. On today's interview, I have with me Kate Woodman, who is an amazing commercial photographer and fine art photographer. She also has a different business, photography related, called the Backdrop Studio, where she makes and sells original artwork as backdrops. You can see one behind her right now.
This one's got a crease in it. Just ignore that. But
yeah, I mean, you can steam those out or iron them out, right? Like with some steamer and a towel or something safe. Yeah. 100%. Also, you can see Kate's work on Pro EDU, where she has 2 different teaching tutorials and all over the place on the interwebs. Basically, all of Kate's links will be in the description below, so you can go check out her stuff and show her some love. Kate is one of my all-time favorite photographers, so I'm super excited to have her on for this interview. So,
well, you're one of my all-time favorite friends, so
yay. Yeah, so I wanted to start by asking you the question that I think is on everybody's mind just in their own life. But how are you dealing with the isolation? What does work look like for you? How are you kind of managing, not just emotionally and creatively, but like business-wise?
Yeah, so realistically, I don't think my life has changed that much in terms of day to day. So emotionally, I'm doing pretty well. Obviously, I miss shooting. I miss through, and I miss making cool stuff with people. But I also have occupied myself with other pet projects that I've been working on, and now have a chance to catch up on. And also kind of playing around with creating cool sets around my house and like trying to create stories that are about kind of an environment or an interior or a space, and trying to make that like feel like a story without having people incorporated, which has been a really interesting challenge because I think we rely so heavily on the people in our images to convey a sense of emotion.
Yeah, we do.
But I think it's still feasible to do that with a space and make a space look really interesting. So
sure.
I thought about doing the whole self-portrait thing, but I can't take myself seriously enough for that, and played around with a couple still lifes, but I think
which were super fun, by the way.
Thanks. But I think what I really like about shooting personally, and hopefully that translates in my own work, is I like shooting people, but I like incorporating a lot of the environment and have that be like a big part of the context. And so I can still create within the environment. I'm just limited to who can be in the scene.
Yeah. Yeah. Which makes that hard. And I mean, I completely agree with you. We rely really heavily on people in our images to kind of drive the story home. So is there something that you're looking for, particularly in a scene when you photograph it without a person, that can kind of make it interesting or help tell a story?
Yeah, I think it's about kind of creating an emotion. So um, for instance, I just shot something in my garage space that I'm putting together a little tutorial for, and it's a really boring space, just like white walls, low ceiling,
Right.
not really that exciting, but
Garage.
yeah, but throw a light outside on a stand and gel it like a full CTB, and then all of a sudden
Mm-hmm.
a blast of sunlight into the garage space, and it kind of creates this kind of feel to it.
Yeah.
So stuff like that, use like playing around with lots of gels and color, because color obviously is a big tie to emotion,
Yeah, absolutely.
and then it doesn't hurt to have a fog machine to play around too.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Always
noticed
adding.
that it makes a big difference for how you perceive the light, right? Like
Yeah.
what the light actually looks like on the scene. So when you're doing that, do you kind of wait for it to disperse a little bit, or is it kind of dependent on what you're trying to do with the scene?
I there's definitely a sweet spot for where the fog should be, and it's always a challenge when you're holding your fog machine and running around and trying to fill the space, and then you're like
Yeah.
running back to your camera and be like, oh, hopefully I have enough time to get like the right frame, and then you just click away until, somewhere in the middle you kind of settle on the right balance of fog to scenery. But
Yeah.
yeah, and everything is always a little bit more interesting without people to help you out. So I'm
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of going
Yeah.
back to my roots here, where it's just one man crew.
I've noticed a lot of times if I'm for some of the articles I'm working on currently, I'm trying to help people be able to kind of utilize their space, and I end up like doing a bunch of weird crap, like duct taping flashlights to things, like because I'm like trying to figure out how to make everything work. So I definitely feel that. So we have Becca and Reality Reimagined with us. Hi, folks. Thank
Hi,
you. If you have any questions for
David.
Kate, make sure that you put them in the comments so we can get to those.
Oh,
Also,
the other fun part about fog machines is trying to not get your neighbors to call the cops on you because they think your house is on fire.
that also makes sense. Luckily, you have all those trees around your house to hopefully kind of like eat and screen things off a little bit.
Anyway,
It is the Pacific Northwest, so you can get away with that. I think a little bit more than I would be able to here in New Mexico, where fog is just not a thing. So,
sure.
So that sounds like it's kind of keeping you busy creative wise. So
Yeah.
with work as a commercial photographer, kind of how are you handling that? What are you doing to try to stay relevant, or, are there even jobs happening that you can bid for, or what does that look like right now?
Yeah, so there are jobs that are happening. Certain markets are still booming. Healthcare is one of those industries, and what I've seen through my experience now, what they're kind of moving towards is more of the stock model. Um,
Okay.
but it's really valuable as a photographer to have composite skills and to have kind of your own reference library of images.
Mm-hmm.
So the stuff that I've been getting requests for is kind of, do you have any stock images of this, or can you cobble together this kind of concept using the existing imagery that you have?
Right.
Um, and so obviously, like it's not the same scale pay wise or production wise as
Right.
your typical commercial shoot, but there's still those jobs kind of floating around, and it's been interesting to see that kind of adjustment as well.
Sure.
And I think
So,
a lot of agencies and brands are still shooting per normal, but kind of under the radar, which
right.
I have not
Yikes.
participated in yet, but I've definitely seen other or talked to other photographers who are still kind of doing that work and taking precautions and whatnot. But
Sure.
yeah, it's a tricky thing to manage, and we're all itching to get out there and start shooting again. But under what circumstances is that okay, you know?
Yeah, that's the hardest part. I mean, you see a lot of people trying to kind of balance this need to feed their families and to, you know, not let their businesses completely crumble with the desire to stay safe and to keep other people safe and to
Yeah.
follow the rules and all of that stuff. And it's really hard. It's really hard to find that balance because on the one hand, you know, eventually this thing is going to pass or become a normal part of how we deal with life, whether that's, you know, through vaccines or whether the virus just kind of weakens over time or becomes a normal part of our yearly schedule. I mean, who knows what that's going to look like, but at some point people will go back to work. So it's hard to navigate how you kind of, you know, maintain your business in the meantime and stay relevant.
Right. And who knows what the lasting implications are for this? Like, how is this going to affect advertising in the long run, or is it, or kind of shift the priorities of brands or businesses? And you know, it's all up in the air right now, and no one has that magic 8 ball to figure out what will happen. But right now, I'm just trying to continue plugging away with still creating work,
Right.
you know, in the safe way, and continuing to pitch my work. So part of what I'm focusing on is marketing and creating promos and kind of getting that stuff out. I was actually working on a promo this morning to get out. And now is a great time to be able to focus on that. And I think a lot of art directors and creative directors are sitting at home and maybe a little bit less busy. So the likelihood of them actually like looking at your stuff and reading your email and going to your website might be a bit higher than normal. I'd like to think optimistically.
So is that something that you would kind of recommend to photographers right now, as far as like building up your marketing materials, making those plans, trying to get that stuff out to their target audience, whether that's kind of, you know, art directors and stuff commercially, or maybe Facebook ads or whatever, you know, to their portrait market or portrait client market, market, wherever that's
tricky.
at.
It's tricky, right? Because for certain industries, I think it's super critical right now. Like the ad industry is still kind of going, and it's going in different ways. So maybe you kind of change your marketing strategy a little bit, and or if you have like composite sales, maybe you want to highlight that. But I think like there's no reason to slow down marketing in that sector, the commercial realm right now, because we will have these opportunities moving forward. And the more attention you can get right now and the more you can kind of stick in people's minds, the more likely it is that later on, you know, they'll, when a job comes up, they'll think, oh, this person sent me 6 emails over the last 6 months.
I
should pay attention to them.
Do you think at this point there is any value in maybe changing your marketing message? Because I feel so. I had been watching an interview not too long ago where they were talking about the kinds of companies who like sailed through the last financial depression, and they were saying that, you know, they were the companies whose marketing language changed because what they said was that people buy generally for 2 reasons. Either they're going toward pleasure or they're going away from pain. And in a recession, people are often going away from pain. So they were changed kind of the wording of their marketing in order to account for what was driving people to buy at that time. So is that something now that you're like taking into consideration, or do you even find any value in that?
I mean, it's an interesting thought. And to be honest, I haven't put too much thought into that. I think for me right now, I'm kind of thinking in the mindset of, is there anything that I can do right now under the current circumstances that would be valuable to an agency or somewhere in-house? Like, you know, pitching, I can do product photography if you want to send me stuff. You know, I've heard of shoots being art directed through Zoom. And, you know, it's the photographer in their own home or their home studio shooting product and doing that virtually, or like I said, the composite stuff. So changing the message in the sense, more the sense of like, what can I do for you now? And how can I apply my style and my skill set to that sort of process?
Sure. So that's kind of the main focus. And then are you at all looking beyond like how this may potentially change photography in the future? Do you see that at all? Is that like anything that's on your mind, or is it just kind of like get through now and deal with that as it comes?
Yeah, I mean, it's both. I'm trying to just go on with what I can do now, but yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I've definitely had lots of thoughts about what is going to happen in the future, especially with the advent of CGI and rendering technologies. I think that's going to start competing more and more with photography, especially given the current climate. I already know
Right.
a bunch of photographers who have used this time frame to kind of take it upon themselves to start learning those types of programs. Um, and so I think it's important as a photographer to be able to kind of find that niche, um, that personal element of photography, or like that type of medium, I guess, is still relevant and is still going to be valuable, and it can't be replaced with something else. So,
Mm-hmm.
for instance, I'm was looking to start a new kind of series, which is creating these narrative portraits of families in their own homes. You know, whether it's like, you know, I grew up in this family house and we have a ton of memories, so let's kind of create this sort of narrative story of your family in that home. And that's something that you'll never be able to do with CGI or some kind of alternative technology, because it still has that personal element to it. So I think that stuff like that, or stuff like, you know, the personal portraits and like boudoir and wedding stuff, that stuff won't change and it'll still be relevant. But as far as the commercial sector, I think we'll see a lot more shifts and variations. It's just, I don't know to what extent and what the timeline of that looks like.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because, like, as we speak on my browser, I have a couple of tabs open for After Effects because one of my goals during this time was to learn how to animate my images in a way that, you know, stylistically works with the images I make. But
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's definitely already, I think photographers just by the market have been kind of pushed outside of the bounds of pure photography to kind of look at video or cinemagraphs or, you know, all of these kind of different areas. And it seems like now where our ability to work with people in person is going to be potentially compromised and we don't know for how long, it definitely is that kind of impetus to like widen our focus a little bit more and find out other ways that we can create visual images that aren't purely reliant on being able to be there in person with somebody.
Yeah, and I think that's not necessarily new in photography. I guess what I mean by that is it used to be you were a technician, you went in, you got the job done, you can make a living doing e-com photography, you can make a living retouching white backgrounds onto an image. Mm-hmm. And now we almost all of us have to diversify our income streams as photographers in order to make that kind of a viable career path anyway. So diversifying our skill set is not necessarily a new thing. So I think more and more photographers are going to be learning new techniques, new programs, you know, becoming not just photographers, but cinematographers or composite artists or retouchers or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to be the way of the future. I also feel like, and I don't really have anything to justify this thought, but I kind of feel like collaboration amongst creatives might be kind of a big thing or trend moving on into the future because of kind of the same thing, right? Like we're expected to sort of do more and more as photographers these days.
Right.
the reality is we can't take that all on ourselves. So I think kind of creating more collectives or more kind of groups of creatives that can work together to basically like expand the production scope of a project might be something we start seeing sooner.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Almost in a way, an advertising agency of collectives without the kind of managing of accounts, right? That way, right. Instead of agencies like hiring freelancers, they come to you and then everything is like able to be done in-house.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that makes sense. And it ties back into a little bit of the conversation I had during the last interview with Pratik, where we talked about this need, and I brought up conversations you and I had in the past, but this need we have to be able to have our fingers in every aspect of image creation. And if this does become broader, and if we're looking at things like animation or 3D rendering or whatever else, there's a reason people specialize in each category, because those are so broad and so detailed, and it takes so long to learn and master and get good at them, that it doesn't always make sense for a photographer to kind of throw themselves wholeheartedly into this other realm where they have so much to learn in order to compete with somebody who specializes there. So it does make a lot of sense to be able to realize that it's the vision that's important. And if you have control of the vision, and then it's okay if somebody else does the rendering, or it's okay if somebody else does the animation, or the, you know, the whatever else it takes to finish whatever you're finishing your project. And I would, I think, really enjoy working in that realm, because I do love working with other creatives. So it's hard, particularly for me right now, having to squish that box down, where a lot of times it's just me, but like there's an energy that you get and an excitement when you're working with those people. So it would be great to see that come to fruition, like a creatives collective.
And I think there could be some serious powerhouses out there if people did band together. I mean, I kind of look at the ad industry and the way it's going, and already you see a lot of stuff moving away from agencies and more towards in-house, and a lot of that is just budget related. But you know, but also like photographers are almost becoming art directors these days, and in order to stand out, because it is such a saturated market, we have to take on the job of, you know, finding ways to make ourselves stand out and be more creative. And a lot of that is, you know, conceptualizing and art directing. And so if more and more photographers can take that on, then it kind of renders the agency art direction kind of obsolete, right?
Yeah.
And so if those photographers who already have not only the technical abilities, but also the art direction and the conceptualizing abilities kind of band together, you could make some seriously awesome stuff.
Yeah, totally agree. Even just the experience of that and what could potentially come out of that is pretty exciting to think about. And hopefully we start to see things like that happening, because just the way even I mean, art has always been kind of an interesting career field, in that it's a difficult one to successfully make a living at for a long period of time, right? Especially as things change and as the application of what we do changes in the industry. And right now, there are so many people who are just out of work in general. I mean, if like you said before, we've been having to diversify for a while. We've had to diversify for a while. And so, and a lot of us, part of that diversifying isn't related to the creative realm at all. A lot of us have regular part-time or full-time jobs that kind of help keep food on the table. So maybe finding things like that where creatives can rely on each other in order to make the kind of product you can't get anywhere else, or that's a lot harder to get when you have to farm out specific pieces to different freelancers who don't have that kind of community setting to work in, could really be an advantage to creatives in a way. Almost makes me think of guilds.
Yeah.
You know, I realize that we have guilds and things right now. It would obviously be on a smaller scale, but I mean, I think your power does go up when you have those other people at your fingertips to be able to call on in order to kind of bring a product to fruition.
Yeah, totally. I think the challenge is kind of navigating the responsibilities, because inevitably you want to pair up with people who have similar aesthetics or kind of interests as you, but then you don't have this definitive delineation between you're the art director, you're the photographer, you're the copywriter, you're the graphic designer. Right now, everyone's got kind of all has a foot in the same door. So
yeah,
the dynamics of that would be interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Especially for people who like to have control, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then those disagreements would be really interesting to have. Like, I think this fill light should be this color. Like, no. I think you're wrong, and here's why.
Yeah, it might be dangerous, but
yeah, it definitely could be. You'd have to remove ego from it for sure. It'd have to be.
How do you remove an ego from an artist?
I mean, look at all of the people who work for production companies. I mean, they just have to make what they're told to make. They lose a lot of their kind of, creative control. It's always been personal projects that kind of fill that need for artists, right? Like, I mean, even the masters, what we would consider the old masters, were painting commission pieces, not necessarily only what they wanted to work on. So I think there's always kind of been that balance between the vision of the artist versus the needs of the public or the buyer or whatever. So I don't know that it would, Oh, I want a patron.
If you want to be my patron, please let me know.
Right? Please just give me the monies. I will make you all of the things.
Exactly.
Forever.
But on my terms.
On my own terms. Yeah. You just get what I want to make. You don't get to make me do things.
Yeah.
Otherwise I run away crying. Right? Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've talked about before that I think is a super interesting topic of conversation is this idea of what makes art and what makes fine art, and what, there for a long time before.
We have an hour.
I know, right? It's going to be okay. We'll make it work. There's been this discussion around photography for a long time because originally people did not consider it an art form at all. And in fact, it's not considered one of the traditional forms of art. And then now it's kind of part of the wider scope, but still there's that discussion around whether photographers are artists or photography itself is an art form. And I'm super interested to hear like what your thoughts are on that, and then what delineates a thing as being a piece of art.
I find that every time I try to ask this question, I end up with more questions than I have answers. So the short answer is I don't have an answer, but it's always fascinating to me that in our minds, when we see a piece of photography, we can kind of identify what category it fits into, right? Like, and by category, I mean like commercial, editorial, or art, fine art.
Right.
And it's always interesting to me, like what distinguishes those, and what makes us identify something as a certain thing, and where do those boundaries blur and cross? And I mean, I guess how relevant is this? Is this just a philosophical discussion that has no relevancy? But it's an interesting point. And in the past couple of weeks, I feel like we've had a fair amount of discussions about how you sort of identify certain elements in a photograph and are able to categorize those things. But I think what we can kind of fundamentally agree on is that commercial photography is created with the intent to sell a product.
Right.
Editorial is meant to tell a specific story, usually about a person or an event or something along those lines. And then fine art is really more a reflection of the artist and the story that they want to tell.
Right.
I think it's obviously that doesn't always apply in something that was initially commissioned as something that's commercial or as something that's editorial. 20 years down the road, once that photographer, that artist has like accumulated a body of work, then that can kind of get, those get sold off as prints, and all of a sudden that's fine art now. But yeah, it's tricky, because I think you have, some people have suggested it's composition. Some people have suggested it's the story. And some people have suggested, it's how much of the artist is involved in the process. But I've done commercial work where compositionally, it's not much different than my personal work. And there's still a story, and there's still a concept. And maybe it's the brand story or concept and not my personal one. But all of those variables kind of apply to each of those categories. Yeah, it's a tricky distinction.
Yeah.
And I think this whole thing was brought up because I feel like I've kind of struggled in defining my own style, my own aesthetic. I've been told that my work either looks too conceptual or too commercial, depending on who's viewing it. Usually it's gallerists that are like, oh, it looks too commercial, and then the directors are like, it's too conceptual. So for me, I'm like, where do I fit into the grand scheme of things? And I've learned to sort of embrace that a little bit more over the years, and just kind of stay true to what I want to do and my aesthetic. And it's taken some time, but I think I'm starting to like finally make some headway in the commercial sector. But I also want to pursue the fine art direction as well. And so, how can I, thinking from the perspective of someone who's going to purchase fine art, right? Like, what is it about photography that makes it interesting, either from the story or aesthetically, and makes it something that they want to hang up on their walls?
Sure. That's a really interesting question too, especially considering I keep looking at this painting-esque thing. It's like a mixed media something that I have behind me. And it's interesting because, when I went to choose a piece for this space, I was not looking to choose a piece that like spoke or said something or was challenging. I was looking to find a piece that was innocuous but pretty and had colors that kind of went with the general scheme of what's going on here. And although I do have a thing a little bit about cherry blossoms, which is the biggest tattoo I have on my body is cherry blossoms. And the meaning behind that, that was not the reason, that I originally chose the piece. So it's curious how there is, and yet this piece exists for no other reason than just to be admired. Like it right. is not like a thought piece or an expression piece or anything like that. It literally is just, it's pretty flowers and birds. So like, and it's not like there's no artistic things happening in it. You have some color contrast, these nice pastel colors, and right. It's just, that's it. That's the only purpose for it. And that's a completely valid reason for a piece of art to exist, just to be pretty. But I think for me, what draws the line, and I guess in my head, what separates the idea of fine art from art in general is this idea that there's something to say there. Like there's either something to say or a question to ask or something that's being explored that goes beyond it existing merely to be admired, that is meant to provoke thought or to, engage the viewer somehow. So
there's a difference between collecting for art's sake and then collecting for design.
Sure.
There are photographs that I would collect because they have meaning to me. But a lot of the stuff that I have in my own house that's hanging up, I choose more just for the aesthetics of it. And some of it has meaning, and it's also very different than my own style. Like there are very few pieces of my own work that I would want to hang up in my own house, not because I don't like the photography, but it just doesn't really fit with my interior design aesthetic. especially because my interior design aesthetic tends more towards kind of historical preservation, accuracy, something that has like a nod to the past and kind of is in line with the style of the house that I'm in. So like, for instance, I have a bunch of black and white, very linear architectural photos hanging up in my home, which is like nothing like I would shoot. But I think they're beautiful. And so I'm on my walls.
Yeah. It's such a strange thing to me that I have the exact same story. I do not, most of what's hanging on my walls, as you've seen, a lot of it is my kids' work. So my kids' drawings or paintings or those things are hanging up. And then a few art pieces that my husband and I have bought for our anniversary. But most of what's up is not anything. And the work that I make is not anything like what I would choose to hang on my walls. And I think that's so interesting that we could have these visual preferences for the work we want around us and it not be the same as the visual preferences for the stuff that we want to make. And I don't know what makes those two things different. But I just find it so interesting that that's a thing. And I've asked several photographers that, and I almost always get the answer that no, what I make is not the kind of thing that I hang on my wall.
Yeah. I think the one exception to that for me is the stuff that I've been doing with the backdrop studio, which the whole point of that is to have this sort of like historical, painterly kind of vibe, like reminiscent of old paintings, which is something I love the aesthetic of. So that kind of stuff, maybe I would hang up, but there's also aesthetically, it's very different than my own personal photography work. There's clearly like a delineation between like my personal conceptual stuff and then the stuff I create for the backdrop studio. So I think that for me, that's kind of like another outlet to kind of create on different terms and in sort of a different aesthetic. While still being able to do my other stuff.
Right.
And if I keep them as kind of separate entities, then I don't cause confusion when I go to market my work. Which is it? Which style are you?
Yeah, that's a hard place to be when you have multiple interests, especially like visually, and then trying to be able to balance those. And then how do you decide where to go or what you're going to pursue and how you're going to market those particular things to the people who need to see them in order for you to like make a living?
That's something I have also like had a lot of thoughts on over my career, because I've definitely often wished that I could be content with just doing studio portraits or just doing the same kind of thing over and over again and have it be like easily replicable and I can do it in my sleep and I can knock it out of the park each time because I have that formula dialed. I mean, I genuinely do wish sometimes that was me, but I'm the complete opposite of that. I have to reinvent the wheel every single time I do a photo shoot, and I have to shoot in a space that has dimension and is new each time. And sometimes I need like 12 lights to light a scene, and I overcomplicate everything, and I do composite stuff. And because of that, like I like to shoot outside and shoot landscape stuff, and I'll shoot natural light stuff, and then I'll shoot studio stuff, and then I'll shoot interiors, and then I'll shoot fashion and commercial. And it's like, I don't want to limit myself to the genres that I shoot, but also from a marketing standpoint, you don't want to feel like you've like Frankensteined a portfolio together. So I think I look at someone like Eric Almus, for instance, who also shoots a pretty wide range of content, but he has a consistent enough visual aesthetic that kind of ties everything together. So as far as like career aspirations go, like that would be kind of the track I would probably like to follow, because it allows me the ability to diversify and to, not have to stick to the same thing over and over again. But I have to be sure that my aesthetic is really honed in so that there is visual consistency regardless of what the content is. And that's a really difficult thing to do. And it's also difficult to recognize in your own work whether or not you've got there, because we can't be objective about our own work.
Yeah. I agree. That's something I've struggled with for a long time, is trying to be like, what does my work look like? I think only
conversations.
Yeah. And I think only recently I've started to come to a place where it's starting to feel more consistent. But even having said that, it's really difficult to, I know that there are some people who can do that consciously. It's really difficult, though, I think, to get yourself in that mindset of what looks like me when you're putting something together. Yeah. It's so instinctual, I feel like, and you make decisions, these aesthetic decisions, like based on a moment of, I don't like that there, and so I need to move it. And once it's moved, you've kind of done that unconsciously, subconsciously. Yeah. Not while you're asleep. You've done that subconsciously, and yet it's part of that, what makes your work look like you. And it definitely seems like that's kind of the work of repetition over time.
Yeah. I think for you, it's been really fascinating to see your work over the last, I would say probably year and a half or so, because, we've known each other for a while now. Yeah. And I feel like within that last, 12 to 18 months, I've really seen your work develop significantly. And I feel like it's a lot more cohesive, and you're kind of finally settling into what you really want to shoot and what is interesting to you. And I think once you can start wrapping your brain around that, like that kind of core thing, like what do I want to shoot and what interests me, then you start to see your style kind of develop. Yeah. Before that, it's hard, right? Because you're trying all these different things, and you're trying to like fit to the market, and you're trying to get paid, and you're trying to, do what people need you to do.
Right.
And while that's important and it pays the bills, it's also really challenging to, make significant progress in your aesthetic, because you don't have the time to dedicate towards what you really want to do.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it's interesting that those changes I've seen in my work have started happening since my youngest one went to kindergarten. So I think having that time to be able to do that, I think has definitely made a difference. But also removing some of the restraints of other people needing me to do or be certain things is definitely makes a difference. Becca is laughing in the comments. She still has monstrous toddlers at home. So girl, it gets better.
I don't know, Becca, you seem like you have a pretty solid grasp of what like the type of content that you want to shoot. You just have children leeching off you at all times to prevent you from doing it at the rate that you want to.
Yeah, agree. I think there's one thing always I love, which I know I've said multiple times, but I love how much story there is in Becca's work, and that her lighting is always so story focused that it's unexpected a lot of times, because as portrait photographers mainly, or people who shoot people a lot, you're always wanting to photograph them in like ways that are flattering. And so you're trying to always find ways to light them that, it tells a story, but it looks nice too. And I always get the feeling when I'm looking at Becca's work that story is the most important part. So sometimes you don't even see somebody's face, but I'm like, ooh, I love that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think that's something that is often overlooked, especially with people who do composite photography. They always want to get like the perfect light on someone. And the reality is, like, if you're trying to tell a story, perfect light is not always the right answer.
No. Yeah.
The last photo series that I did was of this kind of like film noir pulp fiction vibe thing. And the last shot of the series is this like horrendous uplighting on this girl's face. And it like makes her look like crazy and maniacal. And like, yeah, that's the point. Like, she doesn't have perfect light on her face, and she's uplit, which is like a photography no, but like that's what fits the story. And if I had her perfectly, it wouldn't have that same kind of vibe to it.
No. And that's, I remember actually having watched special edition. I want to say it was like the director's cut, but it was of Pride and Prejudice, the Keira Knightley version. And the director was talking about one scene with Judi Dench in it where she was uplit by the fireplace, and it was the most unflattering light in the world. And he felt so bad, like, she's so lovely, and I felt so bad like doing this to her. But it was the perfect thing for that moment in that character. And yeah, that's one of the things I'm still waiting to hear. I'm really hoping to get a hold of some cinematographers for these interviews, but I think that it's so interesting when you look at the cinematic approach to lighting a scene. Took me a second. I was like, cinematographic.
I struggle with that word too.
The cinematic approach to lighting a scene, which I highly recommend. Actually, Khan Academy has a Pixar section where it's called Pixar in a Box, and you can go through and they actually walk you through kind of the simple steps of how they choose to light scenes and what the decisions are based off of. And this idea that you're lighting the scene, number one, based on the part of the story and what the tone is supposed to be. And then number two, where you've placed real light sources in the scene and where those things would be, but also what you're trying to say about the character and how you want people to feel about what's happening right now. So there are all these little pieces that you can kind of choose to play with in order to light a scene where story is the most important part, or character is the most important part, rather than like, pretty faces.
That's awesome. I'll have to check that out. And cinematography has been a huge inspiration in my own work. And I think that kind of the point that you just said, like the idea of using motivated light sources and realistic light sources, and the way that cinematography works is you can't get away with putting light stands and comping them out, right? Like you have to be creative with how you use your light, where you place your light. And it all has to feel motivated, because it often is, right? It's coming from existing light sources. It's coming from lamps or the glow of a TV. And while you're not always able to achieve the same kind of quality, just based on different camera types, like you can't necessarily get away with lighting someone's face with the glow of a TV. Maybe you need some supplemental light there, photographing, but the concept still applies. The idea of you putting a strobe, if you're going to use it, in a place where light would actually be coming from.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the biggest overlooked things in photography, and people are, obsessed with like rim lights and stylizing things. And there's a place for that. But I think to get really good, especially if you wanted to create storytelling work, you have to make that lighting fit.
Yep, agree. And that's definitely something that's been on my mind a lot with more of my recent work is, if I'm photographing often a person in my garage, I'm trying to photograph them based on a potential scene that they could be part of, or a potential story that they could be part of. And so what do I want that to feel like? And where would light be coming from? What color would that light be? I mean, all of that stuff, kind of coming into play. And though it's going to be a little while before, we're able to kind of get people into locations and photograph them, the way that we might want, it's still something to consider, even if what you're doing right now is maybe buffing up your skills in 3D rendering or digital art, or, those things are still like wildly important. And that's one of the things that I've been like wanting to talk or write about in some aspect is how focusing on other art forms actually can improve your photography, because in something like painting, for instance, nothing is there that you didn't purposefully put there, which means that you have to be so cognizant of the composition and where the light's coming from and what kind of light it is, what quality it has, the colors that are there, how those play into the composition. And a lot of times photographers, I think especially beginning photographers, can overlook those things because there's so much already in a scene. And so you kind of take for granted that what's there is just supposed to be there, when really you have a lot more control, and you can carefully place these things and carefully place the lighting and do all of the stuff that a painter would do, or a 3D artist or anybody who's building things from scratch would do. But doing it that way, if you're painting it or whatever, forces you to be so involved in the building process that it can expose your weaknesses, which I've realized is a kind of a big deal. Like composition can very easily fall. And if you have to paint something and you realize now I have to compose it, I can't just like look what's in a scene and then adjust my camera angle and tell my model to stand over here. I actually have to build all of this from scratch.
Right.
So it really kind of lays bare your flaws if you are forced to go at it that way. And I think it's definitely improved my ability to compose a scene or light a scene, because now I'm thinking about that even more strongly.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you're creating a painting from scratch, or even like a render of a space. You have to think about composition first. Like that's the foundation of everything. And in photography, you can just put a camera to your eye and move around, and I don't think there's nearly as strong a sense of compositional technique, especially when you're starting out, because you're right, it is already there and it's so easy. But it is such an important thing in photography. I mean, composition is probably as important as light and as color.
Well, especially if it's a scene where you can add light the way that you want it, then composition comes first, because then light can be built around what you've created. So, I mean, obviously without light, there's no image in the first place. But that being said, composition, light is included in composition.
Yeah.
So sure, that's an important thing, I think, for people to remember, for anybody to remember, for me to remember as well. But the light assists in, develops, etc., the composition. So it's important to take that into account as well. So also, I feel like one of the things that we've kind of come back to a few times in our conversations that I've almost kind of wished other people could listen in on is this idea of how you handle the public, like your idea of yourself as a creator, and then this other idea that you need to be able to kind of interact with the people who are interested in your work, and then be able to deal with it if they like your work and you're like, yay, okay, I feel really weird. But also, you know, kind of like the personal issues and stuff around like how you conceptualize what you do and how you relate to the people who enjoy it, and how that plays into actually how you sell or market your work.
There's so many things there to unpack, Nicole. Let's start with step one.
Indeed, there is.
No, so I really want to just be the Banksy of the photography world and be entirely anonymous and not have to talk about myself or my work. And Jason and I were actually talking about this the other day. We were talking about artist statements and how I think they're kind of a bunch of pretentious BS, which isn't really fair to artist statements, because I will be the first to admit that sometimes I will look at work, and then when I read about the work and the story behind it, it becomes more meaningful and more interesting to me. But I really struggle with this whole notion that I have to infuse myself into my work. I want people to be able to look at it and kind of put themselves in that story and relate to it through their own eyes and through their own life experiences and contexts. Because I don't want it to be about me necessarily, right? Like to me, what makes art successful is if people can create an emotional bond or an emotional attachment to it. And that shouldn't have anything to do with me as the photographer. I think part of the other struggle that I have is that there's sort of this belief that you have to be a struggling artist, right? Or you have had to have gone through some kind of traumatic life event in order to create meaningful art. And I think that's not fair to the people who haven't gone through a lot of traumatic experiences. I mean, who knows? Like I have, luckily, you know, knock on wood, I haven't experienced like tremendous loss in my life on a scale that, you know, could be super impactful, right? And so hope it doesn't happen. Maybe if and when it does happen, I'll be a million times better as an artist. But like, I also feel like, you know, people who are mentally stable and well adjusted can create great works of art without having to like experience trauma.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what I do, if I really kind of analyze it, is sort of try to create these scenarios in my work that I don't necessarily have a strong relationship to, but it's kind of my way of identifying and trying to relate to those experiences without having to go through them myself.
Sure.
And then it's always interesting to see how people who have gone through experiences, you know, relate to certain images.
Yeah.
But I also fully recognize that people want to be a part of what you do, and they want to hear from you, and they want to engage with you. And it is a struggle for people who are more introverted like myself.
Yeah.
And it's not that I don't enjoy having those conversations and those experiences, but also like being able to like take compliments is always uncomfortable. So,
yeah.
you know, like having those experiences and like the deeper conversations that talk about like the meaning of art, of
Right.
your art and that stuff, that's great. But just people being like, you know, fawning over you is weird.
Yeah.
And I think people because certain people may have more of a presence in the photography world. Like I've done a couple tutorials, right? So like my
Sure.
face is now in ads all over Facebook, which is mortifying. But so like people now know my name, and so there's this like weird awkward like deification of photographers who have like sort of street cred.
Sure.
And people think that they're not just normal human beings, and that's not true.
Yeah.
I'm just another person who's making weird stuff in her own house because I don't have giant budgets to go and like shoot at awesome places. And you know, I struggle paying my bills too and have lots of self-doubts. And you know, just because I am good at something doesn't mean that I am the best.
Yeah.
And like a perfect human being. Like it's weird. Like that the whole like mentality of that is weird.
No, I feel that. I had to actually take a couple notes because there were a few things you said that I really wanted to respond to, but I'll start with the one that you just said. And I totally agree. I think when we put people on a pedestal, not only is it going to eventually hurt us for putting them up there because they're human beings, which means they're going to fall off, which means they're going to squish us if we're standing underneath them. Like, so it's not fair to place those kind of unrealistic expectations on other people because they're human. Like you said, they poop just like we do. Like all like whatever gross things, you know what I mean? Like if you pick your nose in the shower, they might do that too.
I
So
haven't shaved
like
my legs in a month.
that's what I'm saying. Like they're just as human as everybody else. So we have to be super careful when we do that. Also, I think it can lend to this dangerous mindset where we assume that they can do what they can do because they're super special somehow, and we're not super special, which means we can't do what they can do, which means we have to rely on them to help us do a thing. And I think that definitely is, I mean, we should admire people and absolutely learn from them if they have a skill set that, you know, we hope that we can kind of cultivate. But then at the same time, we can't make that something that applies only to the special people. And then we don't want to take their skill set and then not make it our own thing. Like you take what you learn from somebody and you make it fit your vision and you make it serve you rather than have you create the things that they make.
Totally.
Yeah. So I'm 100% on board with you there. And then when you said that you don't necessarily want what you create to kind of be you, like to have you infused in it because you want it to be interpreted and kind of bonded by the person who's viewing it. And that brings up this really interesting idea and I've heard people talk about this before, two things. Partly death of the author, which I love talking to people about because I find the concept so interesting. And we can bring that up in a second. But the other thing is, and I don't know if you've ever heard this quote, but they say that the more personal you make something, the more universal it becomes. And so I don't think necessarily that when you make something and you've kind of infused yourself into it or whatever, that means all of the sudden it's applicable only to you. I think when you can delve deeply enough into yourself to be able to kind of create from that, then what happens is that vulnerability is what allows other people to connect with a thing because they have experienced probably something similar. I think we always have this idea that what we've gone through is just ours, when the truth is that everybody has experienced something, pain or loss or elation or joy or whatever. And when we can tap into that stuff while we're creating from, because we only have us, right? Like we can only truthfully get to what we've experienced, even if we're as an example for my AuthorTube peeps, even when we're writing about something that we haven't done, as fantasy writers are wont to do,
you don't play dragons?
I mean, yeah, in my free time. But like we have to take things we've experienced and then make those things stand in for that potential experience. So maybe I've never slayed like an actual dragon in real life, but I've come up against huge obstacles that required courage, right? And I know what that part of it feels like. So then I can translate that into this other space. And so I think that idea of making your work personal actually makes it easier for people who are meant to connect with it deeply to connect with it, because there's so much truth in it at that point, at least your truth, right? So then people who have something similar, it makes it easier for them to like connect deeply rather than just like, that's very pretty, like go on about my business. You know what I mean? Yeah. Which is the thing that scares me. That's the thing that I want to avoid above all things, which if I want to be making key art, then a lot of like, yeah, then like a lot of what I make is not going to be meant to be engaged with deeply. It's going to be meant to communicate an idea very quickly or a feeling very quickly in order to let somebody know what something is. But I guess my personal work, I would want that to deeply resonate. I would want that to be something that was affecting. And I don't think you can do that unless you're willing to expose pieces of yourself while you make it. And that kind of ties into this idea of like artists need trauma somehow. And I don't think that that's true, but I do think that trauma forces you to communicate, right? Because either you have to get things out of you somehow. And if you can't speak about it, then you write about it, like Ernest Hemingway. And if you can't write about it, then maybe you paint it, or there's like some way that has to express itself. And unfortunately, sometimes that can be in like self-sabotaging or dangerous ways. But hopefully for an artist, what that also means is like that can express itself through what you create. And so I think maybe they're just that is just the most obvious version, because those things, number one, force you to like look into yourself. Like when you have shit that you have to deal with it. And so you have to be aware.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good point. And I think the correlation between self-reflection and trauma is an interesting one. But I don't think that trauma is the only trigger for self-reflection. And I feel
not at all.
I spend a lot of time in my head. And I think that's probably what makes my concepts strong, is because I do self-reflect, and I do spend a ton of time thinking, conceptualizing, and trying to think of things. I mean, I'm fighting this perpetually losing battle of trying to come up with ideas that no one's ever seen before, which is impossible. But like, that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming from, is like, what can I bring that's new? Or how can I create something that feels innovative, or it's done in a way that perhaps hasn't been seen before? And so a lot of my concepts kind of revolve around that sort of mentality. And it requires a lot of thought and a lot of research. And so while trauma may be a catalyst for that kind of thought, and being able to like hash out those ideas and kind of figure out an outlet for them, I don't think it's the only, it's not the only thing that does that. And you can have that kind of creativity and that deep thought without having to suffer necessarily.
No, I totally agree. I think it's just that because pain is such a common human experience, it probably is the most obvious one that we're able to like recognize or correlate with.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then, so that brings me to this, like this idea of death of the author, which is a lot more common in, literary circles than I think people talk about it with like visual art, but it's still a really powerful concept even for visual artists. But the idea for any of the watchers who don't know is that the death of the artist basically means that once a piece is created and it goes out into the world, it takes on a life of its own, and the artist kind of no longer gets input on how people perceive or interpret that work. And there's a kind of a story behind that where this college professor is giving a lecture on this piece, and he's talking about how the blue window curtains represent, you know, something about what the author thought or felt or something. And the author happened to be listening in the audience and said, actually, they're just blue curtains. And then the professor is rumored to have said in this proverb, I don't know if it's true or not, but said, forgive me, sir, but you have no idea what you wrote. And it's interesting because that really does become a thing. The interpretation of a work, once it leaves the artist's hand, is so heavily reliant upon the person who views it and their context and their experiences and all of that stuff, that in a lot of ways it does kind of cease to matter what the artist intended. So I find that really interesting, especially in talking with artists. When you mention artist statements, that whole idea of a statement is to give context to the work, right? And that always makes me wonder if we need that additional manipulation in order to make the work understandable as what it was supposed to be. Is that because the work wasn't strong enough to get that idea across on its own? Or is that, you know, is that just us continuing to try to do the human thing, which is to tell stories? And the idea is really interesting to me. So I'd love to hear what you think about it.
And I think it depends, right? I think if you're trying to create a piece of art that is representative of more of a universal thing, or it's not meant to represent like a specific event or experience or something like that, then generally I'm kind of in agreement that like I don't think the artist statement really should be that important. I think the art should be able to stand on its own, generally speaking, and there are always exceptions, but I think if it's like, so I went to the Seattle Art Museum a couple months ago and saw a bunch of these photos of I think it was like prisoners, and this photographer had gone and documented these prisoners and the kind of their daily life. And it was so interesting to like the photographs were beautiful on their own, but it added so much more to read about that experience and like what it was actually about, because it wasn't necessarily obvious from the photos themselves exactly what the situation was. I mean, in some of them, maybe you could kind of infer, but having that context really brought a level of clarity to the images. And those images weren't, obviously they had like underlying context and meaning that people could interpret for themselves, and inject their own experiences, but it was about a specific kind of event and set of circumstances, and it was meant to document that. So I think having that in there added value to it. But I mean, I guess the answer with everything else, like it just depends.
It's complicated. Yeah, no, I agree. I think that that's just a super interesting topic to think about. And before we left Washington State, we went up to the Seattle Art Museum, and one of the displays that they had was a commentary on the Vietnam War, and what they had done was take advertisements from American magazines and newspapers and then cut out photos of things that were happening to the people of Vietnam and replaced the people in the images with the cutouts, put those into the advertisements. And it was this really stark, amazing visual contrast between the suffering that these people were going through and these advertisements that were acting as if this was never happening. And so it required nothing. I mean, the way that it was put together was so powerful that I think the artist's statement surely kind of illuminated different things, or could give you new things to think about. But the pieces on their own were so powerful that it didn't require anything. I guess that's maybe what it is. I think it's great when the piece does not require like additional context. But I think it's additional context is always going to be a good thing, right? If we can get it. But I think the piece should live by itself regardless.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because it was commentary on a specific moment in time and a specific event. And I think you kind of lose sight of that as you progress through history, and stuff that was created as sort of a political statement, 100, 200, 500 years ago. We don't have that context. And so we lose a sense of the value because of that, for stuff that's maybe closer to home, or the stuff that we're creating now.
Sure.
It feels more relevant and more potent because we're experiencing it. But 30 years down the road, are the people who are going to that art museum to see that, coronavirus related artwork, are they going to understand it in the same context?
No, not at all.
I agree. Like hopefully there's art that's being created right now that's sort of meant to reflect on the times and the conditions, that still stands the test of time and can be objectively viewed as powerful artwork in and of itself, even though it wasn't necessarily meant to transcend time. It still has.
Right.
So that's the stuff that's like super powerful. But there's also stuff that's kind of meant to be observed in the moment and is relevant at the time, that is given more weight and more power because we're all experiencing it together.
Yeah, absolutely. And which is, I think, what makes Death of the Author such a profound idea, because we look at pieces of work from hundreds of years ago and we just see this wonderful image, and we don't realize that what was happening inside of that piece, that the painter included things that were commentary at the time, or that were meant to be like a political stab at someone, and then you kind of learn these things, and it absolutely does kind of clarify that and give it new dimension so that you can appreciate it in an entirely different way. But even devoid of that, when we look at those things, we're still able to appreciate them for what they are, even without the commentary, which I think may be one of, I don't know if that's the sign of, a master technician who is able to kind of do both at the same time, or if that's you just dependent on circumstance and style, or, I don't know. Reality Reimagined says, can the art you are speaking of be created to create an opportunity for interpretation that is both meant to occur in the present as well as a new life for the future?
Yeah, and I think that's something that I am always trying to play with, is like, okay, let's so like the Adam and Eve shoot that I did, like the whole premise was like, this is a role reversal, and like Eve eats Adam's ribs. So right, it's a story that is biblical.
Right.
And so that kind of has been around for 2,000 years, but it's also a contemporary commentary on, the roles of men and women. And I happen to be creating that kind of right in the heart of the Me Too movement. And while I'm sure some of that sort of influenced that idea, I can't imagine that it wouldn't subconsciously somewhere. It certainly did. And who knows how that's going to be perceived, if anyone will even see it 30 years from now. But, like if someone sees that 30 years from now, what's going to be the relationship between men and women then, and
right.
gender roles and that sort of thing. But I think that's kind of the line that I I always try to toe is, how can I make this specific, but also broad enough that it will have more of like a lingering impact, I guess? Or how can I make this like nebulous enough in the storytelling that anyone at any point in time could look at it and be like, okay, this is how I'm going to interpret this, or this is how it applies to me. And, and it's really difficult to do. And I'm sure some are going to be way more successful than others, but like for me, that's kind of an example of how I would sort of approach that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, that's super difficult, like you said, because you end up making a lot of assumptions, right? About like of the potential that an idea could be universal in continuity and yet still apply to things that are happening right now, which I think does in a way go back to that personal versus, or that personal becomes universal idea. Because you do want those to apply. And if you have a comment that you want to make on a specific situation right now, you want that to be a thing. But I mean, when you look at something like Migrant Mother, that was very specific to the Dust Bowl, to that particular time in American history. And yet the power in the image remains, despite the fact that there are a lot of people who will be seeing it in the future that have no personal connection or way of understanding what that time period was like. As we lose people who lived through the Great Depression, but we'll still be able to, through just the expression, through the body language, through all of that, because those are very human things, that they'll still be able to kind of connect to that and maintain some ability to interpret it despite not having the exact social context that it was created under. Further Reality Reimagined is saying, or even further, to make it with a specific statement of prediction for the future you see. One piece speaks to the now and your prediction of the future. And that is a little bit, I mean, I guess at that point you're making guesses that the way that we relate now to each other, the environment, our circumstances, etc., is going to remain the same enough in the future that it's still relevant, I suppose, which would be a pretty good guess considering humans haven't really changed much.
Well, that's kind of what I was going to say, is I think that the human experience has been fundamentally the same for thousands of years, right? And so regardless of the era that we're talking about, or for me, I actually spend a lot more time in the past than in the future, because a lot of my stuff is inspired by nostalgia. And that's a theme that's like very intriguing to me for whatever reason. But I think it kind of goes to show that looking through the lens of the past, we can still relate to these experiences in the current context. And I think that can apply later on down the road, right? Like I think someone can see art created now, just as we can relate to Migrant Mother. In 50 years from now, we can relate to art that's created now, because at the heart of it, we're still human. We still have the same emotions, and we may have different kind of waves of regimes or politics or gender roles or whatever, but we still love, we still have relationships, we still war, we still have all of these kind of different ways of interacting with one another that I don't think is going to change significantly in the next 50, 100,000 years.
Yeah, agree. And that being said, we have already pushed our hour. So if there is anybody in the comments who has questions or comments you want us to get to before we sign off here, please put those in so we can address them. And while we wait for that, I want to pick up a little bit on what you just said. I think it's really interesting looking at nostalgia. Sometimes I think creating an image through the lens of nostalgia actually makes it easier to deal with whatever forces you're kind of confronting in the image, because it's a lot easier. I mean, hindsight is 2020. And then when circumstances, and which is, I think, what makes fantasy so powerful, is when circumstances are heightened and outside of what you're currently experiencing, it's easier to look at them objectively and say whatever you want about them. And you can kind of confront those things a lot more easily than you do now. Like, for example, my kiddos who have grown up in an entirely different society saw an episode, I think the first episode my oldest one saw, of Mad Men. And so he's watching these dynamics between these characters, these male and female characters. And he's like, oh my God. And then he's like, he was amazed at how sexist it was. And like watching his response to it was really incredible, because it was so clear to him that like, this is ridiculous. Yeah. But then, and it's a lot easier. Right. And it's a lot easier to look at that now and be like, oh man, things were so messed up. Whereas if you experience a similar thing like that, it's going to be couched in current issues. And so you are muddled by the fact that you're experiencing it, right? So it's not as clear to you as when you see, oh, look at this delicate creature type away on, you know, like whatever. And so you can look at it and deal with it, I think, in a lot more, it's a lot more clear and a lot easier to deal with when you look at it through the lens of nostalgia, as opposed to when you try to deal with that stuff like in your normal life in its like current incarnation. I think that makes it work so much better for trying to get stories and ideas across, because people feel a lot safer approaching it that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think by eliminating the notion that it's set currently, you kind of eliminate the possibility of something becoming outdated or becoming irrelevant, because it's already rooted in the past kind of, or it's already this juxtaposition that's showing how, you know, even in the past, the things that we're dealing with were as relevant then, or are as relevant now as they were then.
Right. All right, so it looks like we have one. We do get to one question before we sign off. So Reality Reimagined is asking, for Kate, your work is very storytelling driven. Speaking to attaining new commercial work, do you push that foundation of storytelling as you pitch or seek new work, or do you ever dumb it down?
I don't think I ever dumb down the storytelling element. I think that's something that's really kind of a buzzword in today's marketing world. So that's something I always want to highlight. And I think it's really important as a commercial photographer. The way that a lot of shoots work is you're creating a series of images. And I think showing that you can create a story that has continuity and it has, you know, a visible, identifiable kind of plot line, as it were, is going to help you kind of sell your skill set and prove to these the people that are hiring you that you're capable of executing their ideas.
Good answer. Cool. Solid. So first, thank you to everybody who came and hung out with us, to Olga, Reality, Ken, Becca, to everybody who came in, to Jay, who was here for a little while but couldn't stay. Thank you guys for coming and hanging out with us and for kind of interacting with us in the comments section. We'd love to have that. That's the whole point of doing these lives. So thank you guys for being there for that. Also, have a look in the description below. We're going to have links to Kate's Instagram, her website, the Backdrop Studio, where she sells these amazing artistic backdrops for photographers. Keep on the lookout for those things. If you found this content interesting, helpful, if you would like it, if you would subscribe or share, that would be really amazing. That kind of helps this kind of content reach other people. We're hoping that interesting conversations like these is, you know, going to be good for the community, help us think and approach things differently. And so would love it if you could engage with us in that way. And finally, Kate Woodman, one of my favorite photographers of all time. Thank you so much for coming and being on the Social Hour and chatting with me. I always love getting into these deep conversations with you. It's like one of my favorite things.
Highlight of my day. Yes. Highlights. Sorry, I'm extremely pasty white today. It's just, I haven't seen sunlight in, 8 months. So
you poor Pacific Northwesterner.
I know. Well, thanks for having me. We can let these guys go and continue.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah, that will be that's what we'll have to do for a Patreon. We'll be like the behind the scenes conversation.
Yeah, 8 hours of this.
Subscribe. Right? It could continue. Oh man, that sounds like a good way to raise money, right? Like Kate and I are going to talk for 8 hours straight. We're going to have all the caffeine. Donate. It's all going to charity.
I like
all right.
I think you're onto something.
It's plans. All right. We're about to drop off of YouTube. Thanks again, guys. Join me next time for the social hour. There are cool people in the docket, so keep your eyes open for that.
Fabulous.